My God, good morning. So Alan and I are going to have fun with going through two complementary but slightly different ways to think about problem solving in the world today. And Alan's been my guide to teaching me the fundamentals of TOC. So I'm going to go through my approach that we use. Alan's going to go through his, and then we're going to have a session together and a Q&A. So let's start with that, part one. I used to work for RCA. I had the two best projects in the company, RCA at the time, high definition television and what would have been the first internet company was Citicorp 9X. Nothing we did succeeded. Eventually we were bought by GE and then we were spun out into SRI. Like in most people in big companies, I hadn't learned anything about how to create value. And now instead of giving me millions of dollars to spend, I now had to earn millions of dollars. So it sent me on the journey to learn the things that I'm going to describe today. I eventually became CEO of SRI. It had been failing for 20 years. I was bankrupt. Everybody disliked each other because that's what happens. And using the methods I'm going to describe here today, we grew 3.5 times. And we learned how to systematically create one multi-billion-dollar business after another. My teams won 2 Emmys, one for high definition television. Nuance was 20 billion, Intuitive Surgical was 100 billion, and SIRI was the last thing when I was there before I retired. That was 75 billion. We sold that company personally to Steve Jobs. So just doing the things I'm going to describe today, we went from failure, going away, within a year of going away, to systematically growing and creating multi-billion-dollar enterprises with the same people. So one of the questions I ask you, and it'd be nice if you answered it, do you consider yourself to be a value creator? That's question number one. And the second, must all professionals be value creators? Doesn't matter what your job is in a company. Should everybody understand the fundamentals of value creation and be able to perform at a level appropriate to the task? That's my challenge to you. I believe the answer to this is yes and yes. So let's see how it goes. I've done workshops with thousands of teams around the world, leading top 10 companies, and typically what we find is that less than 25% of the things they're doing have any value for anybody.
One moment.
Most of the things that go on have very little value. So here's a test that you can ask. I'm sorry, Siri is on my desktop, and when it hears it, when I say it, it speaks to me, so that's a problem. I just put Siri away. So here's a test you can do. Every CEO at least gives lip service to the idea that the world is moving faster and they need to do a better job in innovation. But if you go into an organization and ask people to describe their innovation system, you get blank looks. They have none. I would say that's true of about 99% of the companies I've ever visited. I walk in the door, I talk to some middle-level managers, I ask them what their value proposition or the value process is. If they give me a different answer, then I know they really don't have one. Everybody you talk to in a company at some level should be able to describe how they're creating value for their customers, whether internal or external. So TOC is a little different, I think, than what I'm going to be talking about. So in a way, we're trying to find the critical constraints in a company. That's my little cartoon here. Alan's going to correct this picture in a bit. Find the constraint and see if you can solve that problem and have it disappear. Turn that into an opportunity. In my case, the kind of problems we solved, they started out very ambiguous. We didn't understand the need, we didn't understand the customers, we didn't understand the stakeholders, we didn't understand the technology. High definition television was a perfect example of one where it took us about 7 to 10 years to figure out actually what to do before we could even do a kind of comparisons that Alan is going to show you. So I'm going to describe to you how we actually address these kinds of problems. So when I walk into a company, I look for 3 things. Do they have metrics for what they define as important opportunities, or do they just, whereas the people just kind of confuse what it means to do important work in the company? If you don't do important things, you're not going to make important impacts. Do they have shared language and concepts for value creation? That's the only way you can collaborate. Otherwise, it's kind of a Tower of Babel. And the third thing is, because value creation is a process of synthesizing new knowledge, old knowledge with new knowledge, to be able to create solutions, do they have a systematic process of getting together on a regular basis to make that happen? If they miss one of these three steps, my experience shows typically there will not be systematic success in the company. So just one quick test. You can prove this to yourself. Go into any company, ask them to write the definitions for innovation, customer value, and value proposition on Post-it notes and stick it on the wall, and then have them walk around and look at it. What you'll discover is there's no agreement here. This is a top Silicon Valley company. These are all PhDs from Harvard, MIT, Caltech, Stanford, and Berkeley. And there's none of these Post-it notes have the same answers on them. So what it is, it's kind of a Tower of Babel. And that shows up when you do a workshop with them. They really can't talk about what they're doing effectively. So we asked people, there were 4,000 mousetraps. What's the definition for innovation? Are these mousetraps innovations? No, of course not. They're not. Most of them are not. They're inventions. You can get a patent, but they're not innovations because nobody wants them. It's only about a dozen that people want. So these are inventions. They're not innovations. And it's amazing how many people are confused about this. So invention, something novel, doesn't break the law, reduced to practice. So then what's innovation and what's value creation? Well, value creation is what we do most of the time because we're trying to figure out what to do. It's a process of addressing an important end user and market need with a solution that is better than any alternative and that addresses the needs of all stakeholders. So if you mess this up with a key stakeholder, it's probably not going to happen. So we're putting the pieces of the puzzle together. That's what we're trying to do. And when we start, basically they're spread all over the table. Innovation is the discovery of new end user value to society with a sustainability model and of course with a suitable ROI. So we worked on SIRI for over a decade, high definition television, but it only became an innovation when we brought it out into the marketplace with an entrepreneur. So the next question is, what's end user value? Well, we have to know what that is too. Value is end user benefits over end user costs. And there's a bucket of both of those. So when you buy a car, there's the convenience, there's the styling, there's the entertainment, all that kind of stuff. Those are the benefits. The costs are the gasoline, the price of the car, how far away the shop is, all kinds of things. So as an innovator, you have to understand all these things, and you have to spend a lot of time understanding these things before you can come up with a good solution. And who decides? Well, if I offer Alan here an apple or a pear, who decides? I don't decide. Alan decides. He's my customer in this case. So benefits and costs are only perceived by our customers. They're subjective, and only they decide the value of our ideas. So what you think matters, but ultimately they judge whether we're doing anything of use or not. Okay, so what we tried when I first started at SRI, we started every framework we could think of. We read every book, we talked to everybody we could. I spent about 3 years basically trying out different schemes with my teams. Nothing worked. They didn't work because they were too complicated. The teams wouldn't do them. They couldn't remember them. They didn't apply to everybody. And so basically they just stopped doing them. And since then I've run into every scheme you can imagine, and most of them still don't work. Most of them add confusion. They don't help solve the problem. So we came up with just these 4 fundamental questions. You want to address an important unmet end user and market need with a unique, compelling, and defensible approach. For the offering and the business model, you'll recognize that now as innovation, with superior benefits per cost, both of them, because that's value, when compared to the competition and all the alternatives. Just 4 questions to get started. Now, this isn't the whole story. We'll get to that in a moment, but this is where we start. This applies to everybody in the company. When I went to SRI that had been failing, everybody learned this. And what it meant was everybody in the company started every proposal with the customer. I think we're probably the only company in the world where that is true, where everybody knew that every presentation started with a customer. And I would tell you, just having these 4 ideas across your company is transformative. If you only do one thing, this will make a huge change in your performance. The most common failure, and Alan will talk probably about this extensively, is that people jump from a problem to a solution, and it's almost always wrong. It's a human tendency to do that. We see a problem, oh good, we dream up an idea, a solution, but we haven't done enough homework to be able to really figure out what we need to do, what the real need is before we start coming up with solutions. So this happens almost every presentation we see looks like this when we start. We call them big A's. So keep this one in mind. If you just avoid this one thing and start with the need, I guarantee the efficiency of your enterprise will double. So you want to make your presentation specific, quantitative, and memorable. If people can't remember your pitch, they can't help you. So use whatever you can. Here's a picture I drew. A bad picture is often better than a good description. And that's a segue. And before segues were obvious to everybody, it was kind of hard to describe it verbally. Somebody be standing on a pogo stick. But a simple sketch that takes 5 seconds communicates the idea. And also, in our presentations, everybody says bigger, better, faster, cheaper. I can't tell you. It's so hard to get people not to say our idea is bigger, better, faster, better. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. 1,000 ways to say that. It means nothing. Don't add confusion to ambiguity. A lack of knowledge, I'm sorry, got that backwards. But the point is, if you're not sure, give your best guess. Act like a scientist and put a stake in the ground with what you think you're going to try and achieve. So you probably all know a ketchup bottle, which was just an example of something. And people came up with all kinds of solutions. Here's one that I think is kind of fun that students came up with to solve the problem of spilling the ketchup on the table. It's a fun example. It's not a good example. And then finally, somebody created a nozzle so you could turn the ketchup bottle upside down. I don't know how you folks felt, but I was surprised when I saw that. I go, whoa, what's going on here? The ketchup bottle is upside down. How is that even possible? Well, the person had to develop a new nozzle. It's a pretty special thing. But the point I want to make here is that all useful innovations surprise. If you're not somewhat surprised when you see a new innovation, it probably doesn't matter that much. So that's what we always tried to do. We always tried to surprise people with high definition television or SIRI or any of the things we did. Okay, well, I could go on for a long time about how hard it is to identify an actual need and place it in the ecosystem and then come up with a solution that would actually satisfy the constraints and the limitations and the gaps and all the things Alan's going to talk about. It's really, really hard. So with SIRI, it took us over almost a decade. With HDTV, it took us almost a decade. And we asked people, they usually start at 20,000 feet. They say, well, you know, wouldn't it be swell to have pretty pictures on the TV? That's true. Okay, so we kind of know that. So, but then the question is, how and what are the trade-offs for doing that? So we asked them, what's the situation in the ecosystem? What's the problem? Bad pictures. Why isn't it solved? Well, we don't know how to compress the signals and we don't know how to broadcast it. So what are the limiting factors? Well, it turns out there are 2 things, the compression and the broadcasting. Okay, so at least we pinned it down to 2 things that we need to be able to understand. And then we started trying things and they had pluses and minuses. Alan's going to talk about that. And we kept on going back and forth, but we just couldn't do it for a long time. And from that, we came up with an actual need, a statement for what the system ought to look like if we could do it. And then from that, we came up with an actual solution. So we have people go through this drill. So the iPhone, you know, the situation, rapidly increasing number of applications on mobile phones. Everybody knew that. That was the obvious problem. The keys are small, slow, and inconvenient to use. So you could add more keys. That's what Nokia did. They added more keys. So that's kind of a solution. But Alan would point to you that But this also had a big negative. It's a larger, more clumsy phone, so it doesn't satisfy what he's going to talk about. Nor did it anybody else, by the way. So Steve Jobs had to basically solve two. He needed two what we call key insights. There were two constraints that were stopping this problem from being solved. One, he needed a reconfigurable display because he had to show an infinite number of keys, and you need a computer to do that. The second was, at the time, the way you interacted with the device was with a stylus, which isn't much more convenient than poking at those keys. So he had to have two transformational innovations, which were really a challenge at the time, and he came up with the iPhone. So a small computer, full operating system with a wow factor, multi-touch. He really only had to identify two things, and if he could address those two things, then he could transform the entire mobile community. And that's typical of the kind of things we did. There was usually only one or two things. If we could identify them, we could make a big change. We have definitions for important versus interesting. Typically, it's the number of people who were impacted. I'm going to skip over this. Of course, the customer has to really care. We were always after a factor of 10 improvement in some attribute. And of course, you have to care because, as I'm indicating, real innovations are very hard to do. Somebody's got to really be a passionate champion. Here's a big mistake people make too. You probably all know about the idea of MVPs, minimum viable products. Technologists love that. It's an excuse to build their product immediately. And what we discovered is that's a really bad thing to do. It's usually the wrong solution. They usually spend a lot of money. They build up too big of a team. It gets canceled. This is RCA on steroids, by the way, or GE, or dozens of other companies I work with. They build this thing, they build up these big teams, they don't work, and then the staff is devastated. I did a workshop in one of the 5 biggest companies in the world. Nothing they were working on had any value for anybody, nothing. At the best time in their company in the history of the business, because they were doing this kind of thing and not what Alan and I are talking about here. So we recommend minimum viable experiments. Take the risk out as fast as you can without spending a lot of money. That was our secret at SRI. We followed this path. So most people build fast. They get an idea, they start building, they feel good, they're busy, they build up a big team, and then it crashes, and then everybody feels bad, and the company's got a huge deficit. We went the other way. We spent almost no money in the beginning. We were massively interested in solving those fundamental NABC questions and minimizing the risk by mitigating the risk, taking the risk out. Every time we took the risk out, the value went up. It was then easier to raise money and eventually only going to market when we had a complete story that we had de-risked. We could have gone to market with Siri 2 years before we did, but we didn't have a business model. And typically people will say, we'll figure it out when we get into the marketplace. Terrible mistake, terrible mistake. What we were doing is small experiments to mitigate the risk and come up with a solution. If you do this one thing, minimum viable experiments before minimum viable products, I can guarantee you will double the efficiency of your research budget. I've never seen an exception to it. Kind of amazing. Okay. Here's a quick example. I'm almost done. It turns out that the iPhone didn't work at first. Why? Because it was a small phone. The touchscreen wasn't very good, and you had the same kind of problem you had with Nokia phones. When you touched the keys, you couldn't be precise enough to be able to spell the words properly. So Steve Jobs was about to stop this, and he sent some teams off. I think there were 5 teams. And they were basically doing minimum viable experiments to figure out a way to make this device work. This guy came up with a solution. He said, look, we have a small computer, we have a dictionary, we know when people start typing a word like buffs, the next letter is going to be an F probably. So make the area around F bigger. So perceptually, it feels like the keyboard is being much more responsive. It has bigger keys than it really does. This saved the day. I'm sure phones still have this feature in them to this point. So here's an example with Steve Jobs doing exactly what we're talking about here. Okay, when people pitch, we ask them to put a hook. You've got to tell a story. Every innovation has a story, a definition, and a description. You got to tell a story, interest people so they can remember it. And of course, a meeting without an action is a social event. So you've got to say what you're going to do next. So it's a journey, and we want to be specific and move forward. And of course, you have to practice this, enthusiasm, bring it to life. If people can't remember your value proposition, they can't help you. And this is the magic part of what we did, because answering these questions is really hard and we all get stuck. So we do a lot of reframing. So in SRI, in the workshops we do, and with the companies we work with, 3 to 5 teams will come together. They have to start by answering these 4 questions. We give them 2 minutes to answer them, and they can't do it. They never can do it. There hasn't been one case where they could do it, even though these are PhDs from the best schools in the world and they've been working for years, not one. But what happens is we then give them feedback from the different points of view of the stakeholders. What was good, keep it. What can be improved? Eyes of the end user, eyes of the funder. So we're reframing this. The person's quiet and they're listening to this, and we're helping them get out of the cul-de-sacs that they're in because they love their ideas. Another thing happens in this, and this is really a magical thing that we do. When you're giving short presentations with a standard format like this, the people in the room compare one of them to the other. And inevitably, some of them do a better job than others. And being a little competitive, when the people present the next time, they want to do better. So it's kind of a ratchet, like an eye test that takes place in these kinds of meetings. They're positive, they're supportive, but they're in a friendly way very competitive because people are comparing what a good solution looks like compared to another. And the results you see are kind of magical. It's almost exponential. It is exponential, really. From week to week, when they come back, a level of performance improvement, you couldn't demand it from anybody. You could never, no manager could demand that people do what happens just by being in meetings like this. So to end here, obviously I'm not giving the whole story, I'm only giving a tiny bit of it. But one of the biggest mistakes we see is people jump to a solution before they get the fundamental answers they need. So we recommend answer these 4 fundamental questions. It applies to everything you do. Buying a car, it doesn't matter what you do, buying lunch, everything will fit within this NABC framework. And it sets the direction for what you're doing. And then we add a lot of other things. We add things like what Alan's about to talk about, because that's just the beginning. But eventually we have to flesh out the entire value proposition. And then we have to decide what kind of a plan do we want? Is it going to be a license? Is it going to be another research program? Is it going to be a venture? What kind of a venture is it? What are the regulatory issues? There's a whole bunch of things. But our experience shows that if we start on the left-hand side of this chart, you answer those 4 questions, you get a factor of 2 in efficiency and more than a factor of 10 in value created. So an organization that was failing for 20 years became, maybe for its size, the most productive research laboratory in the world, just by doing these few things that I've mentioned here. So it's a journey. I'm going to skip over this. So that's what we did with SIRI. These NABC value propositions were taking place every 4 to 6 weeks when the team came in. We didn't spin out the company until we could answer all the questions. One funny story here is when we finally formed it, Steve Jobs called up our CEO, who's in the center here. He said, "Hi, this is Steve Jobs." And our CEO said, "No, you're not." And he hung up the phone. Well, he has the privilege of hanging up on Steve Jobs. So Steve Jobs called back. He said, no, this really is Steve Jobs. I want to take you guys to dinner. And we didn't want to sell it, but eventually he made an offer that we sold the company to him. And then, of course, he turned it into something bigger, worth about 75 billion. Okay, but the NABC, this simple idea continued all the way through. It never stopped. It never stopped. So my tip for you is clarify your needs and what you think is important to your enterprise. develop a shared language on value creation. If without that language, your company's a Tower of Babel. It cannot be efficient. And NABC is the most, I think, I discovered, trying everything, the most fundamental 4 questions you can ask that applies to everybody in every position. And it starts with everybody saying, what is the need? And the last thing is, no matter how smart you are, you can't do it alone. Somehow you've got to bring in all these different perspectives and get them to integrate together to create solutions like SIRI, high definition television, intuitive surgical, dozens of technologies in those, and somehow you've got to bring them together. And because we did this as a relatively small company, we were able to beat IBM with SIRI by 7 years. Think of that. That's amazing. It's kind of amazing because we were doing this and we had a way to integrate the ideas and they don't. So it just shows you the kind of advantage you can have. Okay, I think, Alan, that is it for me. Now you have some questions here you added. What's your perspective here?
So I want to start with just a brief story how I met Curt. I had learned about Curt many years ago following innovation. And I was at a globalized accelerator program in Silicon Valley. And Curt came in as one of the special guest speakers. And he asked a question, and I'll give Curt an opportunity to maybe just share the story from his perspective, what question he asked and what my response was. And since then, we've become really good friends and we've been working together. So Curt, I'll give you an opportunity to tell the story from your perspective.
I did a very provocative thing. I asked the audience how many of them use the business model canvas, which is, if you know that, it has about 30 different questions on it. And on the slide, I had the NABC on one side and I had the business model canvas with all those questions on the other side. And I said, I put an X through the business model canvas. After I asked them, do they use it? Then all the hands go up. I said, that's too bad because it's not a good business. It's not a good value creation framework. So Alan, after giving this talk to thousands of professionals who all use the business model canvas, Alan was the only person I have ever met who said, no, it's a checklist. It's not a value creation formula.
My response to Curt was, as I said, I'm disappointed with it because it's not simple, and simple doesn't just mean few parts, but also a very specific sequence in the parts. And that's what impressed me firstly when I looked at NABC, is there's very few parts. There's only 4 parts to it, but there's also an inherent sequence. You can't define the approach unless you've defined the need. You can't define the benefit or cost unless you've defined the approach, this innovative approach. And you can't look at who's the competition unless you've looked at the benefit and cost of your specific approach. So I had asked the organizers after getting Curt's very positive feedback to say, I haven't asked for many favors during the event, but it would be great. I heard that Curt was staying on for lunch. It would be amazing if I could sit close to him for lunch. And the organizer said, Alan, I've got good news for you. Curt already asked to sit next to you during lunch. And that was really, really amazing. And during that time when we met, I asked Curt what was the main challenges that he had in using the NABC approach, because he mentioned these value creation forums and the fact that there's often, multiple iterations that they have to go through. And he said that the biggest 2 issues is with the N and the A. The N is, how do you differentiate between a gap and a problem and a need? And the second part is the issue with the approach, is that there's this human tendency of jumping from the problem to the solution. And the approach is not the solution that they originally come up with. It's actually an approach that's innovative, that doesn't require you to make any significant sacrifices and addresses any of the yes buts from all the stakeholders. And I shared with him the ProConCloud method that I developed, and that's kind of how our collaboration started. So that's going to be my part of the presentation. I want to share with you how the ProConCloud approach can be used for innovation. It was one of the original applications when I invented it as part of my PhD back in 2009, and later refined it with all the work that we were doing in the Odyssey program under supervision of Dr. Eli Goldratt. We started seeing that more and more people were applying it as a way of creating systematic innovation. So I'm going to be talking about that. There's a guiding principle that has been guiding me throughout my whole life. It was a quote that I read very early on by Jean-Baptiste Perrin, a famous French physicist. He said that the goal of all science is to substitute visible complexity for invisible simplicity. And it's really profound when you think about that. So if you look at E equal to mc squared, it's a beautifully simple mathematical correlation. But it explains so much visible complexity out there. So when we start looking at innovation, you can ask a question is, when it comes to analyzing, why are they not buying our amazing product or service? And by they, I mean our dream customers out there, the ones that would get most benefit from the product or service that we provide, whether that is TOC consulting services or some widget that we've developed or some service that we provide. Also, why are they not buying into our amazing idea, product, or service? And that buying into could be somebody that I want to invest in my company, or it could be a stakeholder that I need. So the idea of why are they not buying, or why are they not buying into my amazing idea, product, or service is a really fundamental question. And the second part is, if I can get a good answer to that question, how can I use it to improve our offer, our innovation to make it a true win-win, truly irresistible? When it comes to these two questions, there's a lot of visible complexity. And the question is there really some inherent but invisible simplicity in the art and science of understanding the why and the how? So why are they not buying, and how can we improve our design? And what I want to share with you is the difference between the product and the service, which is that solution that you jump to when you identify a problem, and the actual approach that's innovative, which includes the full offer that you're making, including the business model that Curt talked about. The difference between that product and the full offer is that the full offer addresses all the reasons why they wouldn't buy or buy into. And that's kind of the essence of what I'm going to be sharing with you. So for those that are not familiar with the ProConCloud method, I'll share with you just a brief overview of that method. I called it the ProConCloud method because it combined the best from Benjamin Franklin's ProCon list together with the best of Dr. Eli Goldratt's evaporating cloud and change matrix methods. All three of these methods individually have got major benefits, but they also have some limitations. The ProCon list looks at the pros and cons of making a change, but it completely ignores the pros and cons of not making a change or an alternative. That's what Dr. Eli Goldratt tried to address with the change matrix cloud, is to ask you what's the pros and cons, not just of the change, which would be the pros of the change would be the pot of gold, and the cons of the change would be the crutches, all the effort and the cost and the risk of climbing up that mountain to get to the pot of gold, but also to think about the pros and cons of not changing. And the pros of not changing would be that I keep my comfort zones, I keep all the benefits, what Ellie called the mermaid. And what are the cons of not changing would be obviously the alligator, all the reasons, all the things that are wrong with our current design at the moment. So that looked at the evolution from the ProCon list to the change matrix. The evaporating cloud was a great way of thinking about any solution as a conflict, is that the solution is just one side of the conflict. But the evaporating cloud also had a major limitation, two parts. The one is it only looked at the pros of each option, the needs that you're trying to satisfy, completely ignored the cons of the change versus the no change. And the second part was that it wasn't precise enough. It wasn't clear enough, defined exactly, so that it's very easy for people to follow to make breakthroughs. It was clear enough to be able to use it as a communication tool, but not clear enough as an invention tool. And that's something that I'm going to cover in part 3, is that I grew up learning how to code. And there's a major benefit when you learn how to code a computer, is you realize you can't be vague. You have to define exactly the steps to follow. And it turns out that when you can define exactly the steps to follow and why each step are there, it's not just possible to train humans to follow a process and create a systematic innovation process like what Curt presented with NABC, but you can actually teach the process to a computer. So when I look at the ProConCloud method, we ended up looking at all the benefits from the other methods, how to address their limitations, and we created a 5-step process with each step designed to prevent a common mistake. So step 1 is, what's the problem and why is it important? Just explain what is the problem, why is it important to me and to other stakeholders. And this is trying to prevent a mistake of wasting our limited attention or budget, dealing with unimportant problems or solving unimportant problems, or procrastinating on something that's actually really important. So that's step 1. Step 2 is to say, okay, I have this problem. What is the change I feel pressure to make to deal with and solve this problem? But to always view it as a conflict, that there's a solution or change that can address the problem, but there's also a competing alternative, which is either don't change, which is the inertia component that I'll have to overcome, or there's an alternative if the status quo is no longer an option. And think about the pluses and minuses of each of these two options. And that is why step 2 is called define the conflict and the need. What's the conflict you face in dealing with this problem? And the need is actually not the problem, but the need is, I want all the pros. I want to get the pot of gold without giving up the mermaid or the other positives of not changing, without having to get the crutches and without having to live with the alligator. So that's a great way of defining the need, is to think about, I want all the pros without any of the cons. A true innovation doesn't require sacrifices or trade-offs. So that was an important insight. And step 2 is all about making sure that we prevent the common mistakes where a buyer, in this case, if this is applied to a buying decision, is not buying when they should due to some exaggerated fear of loss, losing the mermaid or losing the potential benefits of their current status quo, or an exaggerated fear of the effort or the risk to make that change, the crutches. But there's also another mistake, is we don't want them to buy when they shouldn't due to some exaggerated frustration or expectation. That's all on us as the inventor, is to help them avoid these two mistakes. So that's step 2, is to define clearly the conflict and the need. Step 3 is to say, how do I resolve this conflict with a win-win? I'm trying to prevent the mistake of either thinking there's only one solution or compromising, and you end up creating a win-lose for somebody, not realizing that there's always 4 ways of solving any conflict. I'm not going to go into more details today, but really option 1 is to say, well, why is the change, or in this case, buying, not a viable option? Because it forces you to give up the mermaid and live with the crutches. Okay, so how do I create a viable option from that? I call it change plus plus. What can I add so I don't have to give up the mermaid? What can I add to reduce dramatically or avoid the crutches? And suddenly I've got a viable option. Option 2 is just doing the opposite, but in this case, taking the not change as, why is not change not viable? Because I have to give up the pot of gold and keep on living with alligators. Okay, so what can I add to get most of the pot of gold, maybe from my legacy IT system, if that's the inertia, and what can I add to get rid of the alligators? That gives me a second option. Option 3 is when and when not to buy, and option 4 is another change, something else that's conceptually quite different. So that's step 3. Step 4 is all about getting feedback. As Curt mentioned, one of the most critical steps in innovation is getting to a minimally viable experiment where you can start getting feedback. And we're trying to prevent two mistakes here. Is every time we present our idea and we get feedback, we either ignore valid reservations that we could have used to improve our solution, or we use the yes buts that we get as excuses not to try or to go further, to say, you're right, it's silly, it's never going to work. So what we want to do is encourage people to give us all the yes buts, but every time they do is ask them, what's the yes and? What can I add to that solution? So over time, I might have picked that the change plus is the best option to go for. And now as I'm adding the yes ands, it will become change plus, etc. So that's what step 4 is all about, is essentially creating an offer that will prevent all the yes buts. It's that difference between the product and the service versus the offer or the full model, business model, is that the full offer and business model that we hope is irresistible contains all the elements that we've had to add to address all the stakeholder yes buts. And then the final step 5, is we want to prevent the mistake of not learning from experience. In fact, we don't learn from experience. We learn from doing experiments. So this is the part where we want to turn this full analysis that we've done so far into a minimum viable experiment, as Curt mentioned. And that's essentially just taking your full analysis and answering very clearly the why, the what, and the how of your full analysis. So why are we doing this? What's the problem? For example, some kind of disharmony in organization, and why is it important? What is it that we're trying to achieve? We want all the pros, none of the cons, or as many of the pros with as few as the cons. And how are we going to do it? It's going to be the change plus, all the things that we've had to add that gives us those green flags. And then the final thing is just doing it, right? Is actually managing that and seeing where we are, treating this experiment as a project to learn from and get those rapid feedback cycles to prevent procrastination, getting distracted, or worse, multitasking. So that's just a brief introduction of the ProConCloud method. For those that want to try it, you can try it out. We've built this into our free Harmony Decision Maker app that you can download from all the app stores. So when myself and Curt collaborated, like I mentioned, he asked this fundamental question to our group, is what is innovation? And like with most of the groups, all of these people were very, very qualified, and few of them actually mentioned the word creating value for the user and the innovator. Dr. Goldratt had a great definition of value. He said value is created by removing a significant limitation or trade-off for the user, which is a win for the user, in a way that was not possible before, and to an extent that no significant competitor can, which is the competitive edge that it can give you, and which gives you the win for the innovator or the company. So that's our starting point. And what we wanted to do is through our collaboration, is to check if this hypothesis is true. If we can help somebody clearly articulate the conflict or the contradiction that exists because of the current solution that's in conflict with the inertia or the status quo, an alternative solution, and we can guide them through the process of resolving that conflict without having to give up any pros or without having to live with any cons. Could we accelerate dramatically the way that they can get to an innovative solution and reduce those number of cycles that Curt was talking about? So how do we apply the ProConCloud method in this case? So a couple of key insights here. So step 1, I mentioned, is the problem and why it's important. The important part here is essentially the gap. So I want you to think about the value potential that a specific product or service could have versus the current value in the market. So that could represent the total sales that might be possible and the current value of your sales. You can apply that, for example, to TOC consulting or TOC software, right? What is the addressable market if you have to put a value to that in dollar terms, and then think about your current sales, right? So I'm sure you will agree that that often results in a massive value gap. Now, what's the problem? The problem is one of those things that if you could solve for the customer, your dream customer, it will significantly, measurably close that gap. So something that if you can solve that problem for them will get them to willingly pay more, buy more, or buy more frequently. Those are big, big leverage points. So that's the problem, a very clear articulation of the problem that is blocking your dream customers from buying or from buying into your idea, your product or service. So quantify that gap. Don't try to be more accurate than the noise. Often the magnitude is so big, but try to quantify it. Like Curt said, don't make the mistake of just saying bigger, faster, better, cheaper. The second step is then to say, okay, from this problem, now that I clearly understand the problem, what is the proposed solution that the team has come up with that can solve that problem? But then articulate what is the competing option. It's either no change in the current product or service design or some kind of other change. But then go about articulating the clear pros and cons, the unique pros and cons of each of these options. And now we get to the need part. What is the need? The need is not the problem. The need is I want all these pros at the top, and I don't want any of the cons. That's a very clear definition of a need. And when teams are encouraged to present it like that, they get much, much faster to that need statement that doesn't require so many iterations. So that's what step 2 is all about. Step 3 is about the win-win approach, is to pick one of those 4 options that I've mentioned to come up with a way that you get all the pros and none of the cons. So we encourage the teams to try all 4 options, change plus plus, not change plus plus, or another change plus plus, when and when not to change. So when should we use the proposed solution versus the competing option, or a completely different one that has nothing to do with our original design. And that's the 4 innovation options that we guide the teams through. Step 4 is now thinking about all the yes buts. And a very, very important thing here is, who's your biggest competition? Your biggest competition is not the company down the road or maybe across the ocean that is making the same product or service than you are. Your biggest competition when you're innovating is the no decision of your dream customer. So try to identify all the stakeholders and get them to give you as many yes buts as possible, but for every yes but, ask for the yes and. So yes, I like your new solution or your new win-win approach, but it's not yet sufficient for it to be a win for everybody. That's the first type of yes but. Yes, I like your solution, but it might have some major negatives if it really works for one or more of the stakeholders. That's the second yes but. Third yes but is, yes, I like your approach, but there's some implementation obstacles. And what we do is we can sequence these yes ands that we get to give us a little roadmap. And that often gives you that one thing, as Curt mentioned. There might be some limiting condition that comes up with these yes buts that says, look, we don't know how to compress the signal. That's one of our implementation obstacles. So guess what's the first thing that you'll have to do as your minimally viable experiment is to find a solution for that. Don't solve problems out of sequence. Don't start thinking about other problems when you haven't yet solved that one specific problem. So that's what we do in step 4 is we use the yes buts to create a plan for our minimally viable experiment. And we sequence that based on what's the first thing we have to solve before we should go on to the next one. And then the last one is actually use the full analysis to create this minimally viable experiment, a kind of a project charter. Why is the change needed now? Whatever you've written in step 1 as the problem and the gap, why it's important, that's what goes into that why box. What's the objective of the change? Whatever you did in step 2, which is the need, I want all these pros and none of these cons. That's what are we trying to achieve. The how is from 3 and 4, basically whatever your selected solution was, plus all the yes ands that you've had to add. And that second why there is, why is the objective possible but difficult, is essentially the assumptions that you challenge and the key yes buts that you've had to overcome. So we're getting close to the end. So what I'll do is we've included this in some slides. I wanted to give you some examples. This is an example that's often used in innovation, is to show how Nespresso came up with this idea of Nespresso capsules. So the problem was home espresso machines are complex to use and expensive. There was a solution proposed to make it simpler, for example, by removing the grinder. But at the same time, there was also pressure not to do that, but to find a way of making the espresso machine with the grinder just at a lower cost. Each of those have got pros and cons. Was there a way that gives you all the pros with none of the cons? And they came up with the idea of coming up with a capsule that can capture the aroma of the coffee and yet solves the problem of it being complicated to use and being a real mess to clean it up. Then it's like, okay, let's put this out. And who are all the stakeholders here? The retailers, they said, yes, we like it, but we're not willing to stock another product for you. So what's the yes and? We have to offer capsules online initially until the retailers see that there's big sales there, and they will come to us and we'll show them that by selling capsules, they can get actually a higher revenue per square feet selling the capsules than selling just grounded coffee or others. The user themselves, they said, yes, we like the capsules, but won't it increase the cost of a cup of homemade espresso? And they had to show through advertising that actually your cost per cup will come down. And another yes but from a user was, will it really taste and smell like real espresso? And they started offering in-store promotions. So capturing all of that knowledge into a minimally viable experiment gave them the option to go and try it out. And I've included another example, which is how Elon Musk came up with this idea of rockets that can land. So before we kind of summarize, what we did was we did some field testing. We tried out this approach. We had a 5-day challenge of why are they not buying, and we wanted to see if using this methodology to identify all the reasons, the conflict that the buyer has got and how to resolve that conflict with all the yes buts that they might have, will that allow you to build solutions that are truly innovative, that are truly win-wins? And again, in the slides, I've included some examples. We had one of the companies that participated in the challenge was one that sold way less programs, keto way less programs, and you'll see there what was the problem and its importance from the buyer's perspective, the conflict of the buyer, whether to invest in the keto program or not to invest. Each of them have pros and cons, and their bias is towards not investing. They're constantly looking for reasons not to buy. And they will, because they're looking, they will find it unless you can find a way of proactively addressing that. And that was the 4 options that they tried. They ended up selecting option number 1 as the solution that they most desired, but also selected option 2 as a downsell in case they really didn't want to buy. What else can they get the buyer to buy just as a small part? And that was like, as for a small fee, you can get a list of what to avoid, and here's a little tracking device, maybe for a small fee. And they used all the yes buts from the buyers, the sellers, and other stakeholders to make the solution even more robust. This is one that I included in terms of selling TOC consulting services, so that might be interesting for a lot of you. The last part that we want to share before we hand it over to a final summary and questions is, as I mentioned, when you are coding, you have to be precise. You have to say exactly what the steps are and how to follow the steps, when not to follow the step, when to follow it in what way. And we started becoming curious as we started collaborating, myself and Curt, is could you actually teach ChatGPT to follow a process like NABC or the ProConCloud method? And this was the first prompt I gave to ChatGPT. I said, can you please do your best to answer these questions for an example? And we provided an example. We were actually presenting to one of Curt's teams, and he said that they're working on this complicated robotics algorithm. And myself and my research assistant, Theo, we were like, how do we prepare a ProConCloud for swarm robotics, which we have very little intuition about? And we actually gave this description of the ProConCloud method to ChatGPT, and we said, can you apply this to swarm robotics? And this was the answer it gave. It actually followed the steps exactly and gave remarkably good answers to each of the steps. And then we could simply put that into our template to show how this could come up with a new invention. And when we shared this with the team, they were very, very impressed of how good ChatGPT ChatGPT is. And since then, we've been trying it out, and it really is an amazing support tool for teams that are going through it. So the one part of what we're presenting today is make the process simple, like NABC or the ProConCloud method, so that people can actually follow it and will keep on trying it and learn and get better. But then this added thing is you now have this incredible collaborator called ChatGPT, which you can teach the method and you say, apply this method to this problem that I'm currently facing, and you will be absolutely amazed at the results that it's getting. So we're going to open it up for some questions, Q&A now. I included these final thoughts between myself and Curt for you. So just remember, the innovation process must create value for all the stakeholders, else it's not a true innovation. True innovations resolves conflicts or contradictions. It shouldn't require you to have to live with any sacrifices. It should be simple. There should be few steps and a specific sequence to complete the step. And the simpler it is, the easier it is for humans to learn and apply. But also the other benefit is, the simpler it is, the more precise it is. It's also easier to learn for AI to learn it. And when you get AI to be able to learn it, you can get a tremendous helper. You need to get fast feedback cycles to allow human teams and AI to get better and better. So every time they give you an answer, give them feedback about what they did wrong. This is called technically humans in the loop reinforced learning. So you're giving them feedback so they can learn not just from their own example, but also from watching the other teams. The most valuable feedback that most people are not seeking or not acknowledging is the yes buts from your dream customer or your dream investor. That no decision of theirs is your biggest competitor, but also your biggest enabler to improve your design. And we would love to get your feedback testing out the NABC and ProConCloud method. So
Alan,
we'll
before
hand
you
it
go
over to Q&A.
Oh, Alan, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Go back a couple slides to the one where the one with the cloud with your that one. I'd like the audience to look at this picture. Stop right there. Yes, right there. Look at this picture and then imagine you're an executive at Nokia. You understand the gap on the left-hand side. Your people are yelling at you about how terrible your phones are. And then you come up with this solution and you're comparing it with what you have. And the solution is to add more keys and build this big phone. Now, if they had just drawn this picture alone, Alan's picture, I think this is a really important picture. If they had just drawn this picture, they would have had the pluses and the minuses. They would have understood that completely. And then they would have put this new phone on. It would have had a slight positive because it had more keys, but it would have this huge negative on the bottom. And I'm convinced if they had drawn this picture and they looked at this and they had to confront this picture, they never would have built that phone. It just makes no sense at all. It's an embarrassment. And I think when you're in these meetings, and what Alan is trying to prevent people from doing is they end up in these cul-de-sacs and they don't actually think about these steps. What does it actually mean? And putting them on a paper or on the board and actually having to confront this, oh my goodness, look, yes, we added a slight positive, but look at the huge negative we just added. This is not a solution. And then Alan also said, well, people get stuck. Well, yes, but and yes, and. These are all reframing techniques to get people to look at the problem a different way. And what Alan has done here is he's laid it out so it's a series of visual steps so you don't get lost, which is a very different thing.
Yeah, no, I think, like I mentioned, is not just to take that list of yes buts and yes ands, but then to sequence them, to say, okay, which yes but must we address first? Because that gives you that one thing, that limiting factor, that unless we can solve that problem or that yes but, nothing else matters. Whereas we have these teams working on multiple things, and some of the problems that they're working on are 4 years away and actually will not be relevant at all if we can't solve this one thing now. So that to me was a big aha.
Well, so for example, with something like high definition TV or SIRI, That's a sequence of events over a long period of time where you take the biggest constraint and you try and solve it first. You say, what's essential? If we're ever going to solve this problem, what's the one thing we have to solve first? And that's what you focus on. You don't spend a lot of money on it. You just prove to yourself that you can do it before you start building solutions. By the way, in the case of high definition television, the Japanese, their equivalent of the BBC, came up with an analog system. It cost a fortune, was full of negatives, eventually went bankrupt. And of course, then the system we developed became basically the world standard.